Hello guys, welcome to Redditor's Revenge. Here we post amazing revenge stories daily. And if you want more content like this, please do subscribe to the channel and stay tuned with us. Moving on to today's first story, which is about OP getting revenge on her mother-in-law after she made OP's entire married life a living nightmare. Now story. I 28F have been married to my husband for 2 years. We met on a trip he had to England, and after we got married, I moved with him to the United States. However, the one pickle was that he was an only child and his mom had some major health issues. This meant that she had to stay with us at home and I had to take care of her a little bit, even though she had a nurse who came in the morning. It was perfectly fine at first, as she didn't talk much and I thought it was just because of her illness. We would barely speak to each other, but she smiled and treated me fairly for the first couple of months, and I gave her my all. However, after those initial 2 months, things took a turn really fast and she started becoming a completely different person. Once she was healthy enough, she began making my life a living hell and I had no idea why. It all started with her constantly talking about me behind my back to my husband and our family. My husband didn't like to keep secrets from me, so he would ask me if I did this and that. She would fabricate some seriously insane stories and blame me for things I never did, such as leaving her without food for hours and neglecting some of her basic needs. This was absolutely insane, as I probably cared more for her in these 2 months than I did for my real parents. Anyway, I tried talking to her and asking her why this was happening, but she denied everything and told me that whatever happens, happens. I never understood what that meant, but she was very non-confrontational and always hid behind my husband. Anytime I would try to talk to her about anything, she would call my husband and use him as an excuse. Another time, she claimed that I left the stove on and that I almost burned the house down, even though that morning I didn't even step foot inside the kitchen and ordered breakfast from outside. When I tried to explain that, she insisted that I must have entered and forgotten, and that my irresponsibility would get her and my husband killed. I was literally counting down the days until she was well enough to leave, but it seemed like she enjoyed staying over and making my life miserable. Of course, she would always put my husband as her baby boy and act very jealous and defensive of him. Not only that, but because I was British, I got the worst insults and stereotypes of my country ever. Every time she did that, I just kept thinking that she was very old and from an older generation, but it never justified it. One time, I came back home and didn't find my husband. I asked her where he was, and she told me that he would be working late and that he would have dinner outside. Of course, I believed her, and when I asked her if she wanted to eat anything, she told me that she ordered takeout and that she was good. So, obviously, I didn't cook and just ordered something for myself. To my surprise, an hour later, my husband came home from work and hadn't eaten, expecting me to have cooked dinner. When I asked him about working late and having dinner outside, he told me that he wasn't doing that. Of course, my mother-in-law threw a fit about how I ate alone and didn't even cook anything for my husband, who came home hungry from work. I was livid that day and just snapped at her, telling her that she told me all about him staying out late, and she yelled back at me. It was a big fight and my husband almost had to pull me away from her. When we were alone, he explained that he was supposed to work late, but that he called his mom afterward and told her that the plans were canceled and that he would be coming home normally. She intentionally neglected to mention that and just left me to be embarrassed. Perhaps the absolute worst thing she did, however, was blamed me for not being able to have kids and actively trying to make my husband dump me and marry someone else. It all started with basic gossip and telling everyone that I was infertile, and it got all the way to inviting her distant relatives to our house while I was outside, so that she can try to bait my husband into marrying one of them. When I confronted her about it, she asked me what good is a wife who can't have a kid, and that I should be okay with my husband having a child with another woman, even if I get to raise that child. I was so disgusted by her ideology, and anytime I mentioned adopting, she said horrible things about foster children, and how she can never trust one of them in her house. It took a long time for her to drop the whole kids thing when my husband told her that he wants a couple of years without kids first, and then consider it. My husband was perfectly reasonable and he knew that she wasn't all there in the head, so he always just tried to bear whatever she threw at us and then apologized to me later. Even he wanted to get as far away from her as possible, and once she was healthy enough to live on her own, he took a job in another state and we were set to move. She was convinced that I made him move and leave her, and she made a whole dramatic act about it. But he finally stood up to her and told her that he decided to move, and that he couldn't stand her toxicity anymore. This might have been the only moment where I saw her heartbroken. Once we moved, we had 6 months of absolute peace and the happiest we had ever been. We were able to eat whenever we want, watch whatever we want, talk about whatever we wanted, and go out and even go on vacations. It was absolutely perfect, until one day my husband told me that his mother was visiting. I was furious, but he told me that it would only be for a couple of days and that she would be leaving quickly. I had truly hoped that those 6 months changed her a bit, but you don't always get what you wish for. This was in March 2020, literally days before the lockdown of the pandemic. She arrived, said her hellos, pretended to be an absolute saint because she had missed her son terribly, and spent a day that was actually not bad. She barely spoke to me other than the formalities, and I was perfectly fine with that. By the end of the day, though, it was like her evil spirit started to wake up again. In those 6 months, since my husband and I was having so much fun, I had gained a little bit of weight. It took her a whole 7 hours to finally comment on it and ask me what had happened, and when I told her, she kept going on about how extra weight is bad for women and kept recommending diets and workout plans for me to follow. So I just kept nodding my head and telling her that I would get right on it. I just wanted her to be gone, since she was supposed to only stay for 2 days. The next day, however, I woke up with agonizing pain in my throat and I was barely able to speak. We instantly went to the doctor, who told me that I have a severe throat infection and that I would have to recover for a few weeks. He gave me a list of very specific foods that I was only allowed to eat and told me not to eat anything else, as it could destroy my throat. Out of the apparent kindness of her heart, my mother-in-law decided to stay with us for a couple of more days, claiming that she wanted to make sure I was fine, but I knew she was just there to see me suffer. That night, my husband and I went to the grocery store to have my list of food that I was allowed to eat, and I had enough stock to last me a couple of weeks. My mother-in-law was going to stay in the guest room, and I just hoped for the best. This was a fool's wish, though, as the very next day, a lockdown happened due to the pandemic. Because of the lockdown, my mother-in-law couldn't leave, and pretty much nobody was going out of their house. We were stuck together inside, and it was my worst nightmare. Nobody knew when this would end, so we had to stay like this for the foreseeable future. To her, everything was fine as she was used to living with us, but I had finally gotten my freedom and didn't want her anywhere near me again. This time would be even harder, as we didn't have the luxury of going to work or even getting out. I knew she would come up with her weird schemes and shenanigans again, but this time I was at home with her, so she couldn't claim things behind my back. The first couple of days were relatively normal, as we were just getting used to the new routine, and everyone was too busy freaking out about what was going on outside than inside. Once the dust settled and everyone had their plans and knew what they were going to do at home, we had enough free time that would bring the worst out of all of us. She quickly went back to her old ways of literally criticizing every little thing, but now was even worse, as she had this obsessive-compulsive disorder about the whole pandemic. She wouldn't take off her mask whenever she was close to me at home and would always be spraying stuff and just generally always giving me the stink eye, as if I started the whole virus. She couldn't come up with stories about things I did or didn't do, as my husband was always at home, so she focused her attacks elsewhere. Because I was still struggling with my throat infection and had my own food for 2 weeks, one day I woke up to find literally none of it. I looked everywhere, and when I finally asked her, she told me that she threw it all out. I went absolutely mental and asked her why in God's name she would do that, and she told me that it was contaminated and we couldn't eat it. It was a nonsense excuse, of course, and just a reason for her to torture me even more, which she did. For an entire week, I had no food to eat, as anything we had severely hurt my throat. We couldn't go to the supermarket, and everything was closed. They had their own food, but I had to go on a water fast for pretty much an entire week, and lost 3 kilograms because of it. I was unbelievably hungry, and my MIL literally rubbed it in my face for constantly eating in front of me. This was probably the one that hurt me the most, not just physically, but emotionally. I couldn't believe how someone would lavish on someone else's pain like this. My husband couldn't say anything to her, as it was just a lost battle from the beginning. We didn't know what to do, and we couldn't kick her out. I sat down to talk to him, and he told me that she can't change. Every time I asked him why she hated me this much, he would just tell me that she was never a fan of people in general, and other than him and his late father, she pretty much had something against everyone else that she knew, so it wasn't my fault. Some people simply don't like other people, and they're willing to go to such lengths to make themselves feel good about it. After my week of suffering was finished and I started feeling better, I knew that I had to get my revenge and that I couldn't just let her go like this. I was beyond peace at this point, and I just wanted her out of my house in any way possible. We had finally figured out the food situation and managed to make a trip to the supermarket, so I was set when it came to food. She, on the other hand, was constantly eating and finishing up all of our supplies, so I decided to do something about it. I read up about chemicals and swelling and their effects. I wanted to hit her where it would hurt the most, which was food. I needed her to feel the same way I felt. The next day, I offered to make breakfast for all of us. I knew she would complain or criticize, so I just went ahead and did it anyway. My food and my husband's food were fine, but I put in a little extra kick for her that would make her day. As soon as we started eating, she commented about how the food tasted weird, but I was just waiting for what I wanted to see. After eating for about 10 minutes, she started screaming in pain from her mouth and tongue, and her tongue was extremely swollen and blue. The substance I put in her food worked, and I was struggling so hard not to smile and laugh as I saw her in this much pain and unable to do anything. She kept begging to go to the hospital, but of course, all the hospitals were filled with cases because of the pandemic, and there was no way that she would find a place or a doctor. I pretended to call the pharmacy to get some medicine for her, but I intentionally got her a placebo. I made it seem like I actually tried to help her, but the medicine I ordered would do nothing to treat her tongue. She was in agonizing pain the entire day and nothing she did work. She stayed like this for 4 days where she couldn't eat or drink anything other than water, so karma struck in my favor. Not only was she in pain, but she was also struggling with food and hunger, and after the first day, she was just in bed resting the whole time and had zero energy to do anything. On the 4th day, I went up to her while she was helpless and frail in bed and finally asked her the one question I always needed an answer to: why she hated me so much. At first, she also tried to do her whole tough denial act, but then she finally got serious and told me. She told me how my husband was her baby and the only one she cared about after his father's death when he was young. She told me how they spent their entire life together, just the two of them, and had all their memories together. She could never imagine him growing up and leaving her alone, and she always wanted to deny that, so she thinks that I came and stole him from her. It all suddenly made sense why she hated me so much. It wasn't hating me specifically, but hating anyone that would have been in my position. I felt the tiniest amount of sympathy for her, but it didn't justify all the horrible things she did at all. I told her how being so obsessive and protective ended up ruining her relationship with her son, not strengthening it. I told her about all the things I always wanted to tell her, and how she was as much of a plague as the pandemic that was going on. I told her that I would rather get the virus than spend another minute with her, and that her son doesn't even want her here. Because she was so frail and weak, she could barely even reply. After her tongue recovered a bit, she got back up on her feet but decided to leave. She told us that she would never come back because I was a crazy woman who tried to kill her, even though she didn't even know where the infection came from. I could have hidden the fact and had her believe that it might not have been me, but I told her in her face that it was all me and that she got what she deserved. When I asked my husband in front of her if he wanted her at the house, he said no, and it was finally clear to her that she was unwelcomed by even her son. She looked so disappointed in him but eventually left, and we never heard from her again. Now here is the end of our first story. I hope you enjoyed the revenge OP took on her, a whole mother-in-law. And I believe she deserved everything that's coming for her, for being a complete witch to OP. I have seen people getting jealous and possessive to their loved ones, but she loves being toxic. Guys, let me know what's your opinion about OP's MIL, and you can also share your stories about your toxic MIL in the comments section. So before moving to final story, please hit the like button and do subscribe to the channel to stay tuned with us for more awesome stories.
Now, moving to our final story, which is a quick but satisfying revenge story about how OP's friend shuts his client's entire business after he refuses to pay him all the money he deserves. Now story. My buddy is an accountant. He has his own firm. His biggest clients are small to medium-sized businesses. Well, he had a client who owned 4 different clubs, bars in 2 different cities. The client was always shady, always slow on payment, etc. I was also a customer of one of the bars. They had a poker game that I would play on Thursdays. Well, one day I'm at my buddy's house, having a few beers, and he's bitching about non-payment from a client. I ask who, but he doesn't want to say. But it's bugging him because it's a significant chunk of change. He then says the name. We'll call him Scott. I'm like, wow, Scott isn't paying you. He then says Scott is saying business is way down. And I think that's odd. I've been going to one Scott place and every Thursday is packed. My buddy looks at me and goes, really? I go, yeah. He does this new cash discount thing, 15% off your tab if you pay cash. And my buddy goes, really? I tell him about my experience at Scott's bar, and eventually the topic changes. A few weeks later, my buddy calls me up and says, you going to Scott's bar to play poker? I said yeah, and he says, can I join? I go, sure. He joins, we get a few drinks in us, lose our money at poker. My house is closer, he decides to crash there. On the way over, he breaks down his theory. He thinks Scott is vastly underreporting his revenue. The reason why he suspects Scott is offering a cash discount is cause cash is easier to hide. He says he's going to do a deep dive on Scott's finances. My friend tells me he plans to go to all 4 of Scott's establishments, get the prices he charges at each place, and piece together how much alcohol he's buying versus how much Scott is saying his revenue equates to. He looks up how much Scott is paying in payroll, rent, bills, etc. Keep in mind he has access to all this info. And he determines that Scott is using his credit card receipts plus a little bit of cash to cover the cost of his business, including rent, payroll, insurance, liquor, food, etc. However, based on the number of products he's selling, he's suspecting Scott is underreporting his total income by about 35% to 40%. He goes back into Scott's books even more, and he figures in the last year Scott has been underreporting his sales by 35% to 40%, but he's also been underreporting his sales by at least 20% to 25% for years on end. Simply put, there is no way Scott is going through as much product and as much alcohol as he's purchasing, and having the revenue numbers that he's claiming. He's underreporting his sales to his accountant. This means he's also underreporting his earnings to the IRS. By this point, Scott owes my friend thousands of dollars that he hasn't paid. He said his total amount owed could buy a brand new motorcycle. He never gave me an exact number. My friend decides duck getting repayment from Scott, lets us get repayment from the IRS through the whistleblower program. He's estimating Scott's underreported his revenue by millions of dollars over years. The whistleblower fees he'd earned from the IRS far outweigh the amount Scott owes him. The IRS will pay between 15 to 30% of what they collect. So with the assistance of a lawyer, my friend gathers all the evidence he has Scott's underreporting to the IRS and files a whistleblower report with the IRS. During this time, my friend fires Scott as a client for non-payment. Now, this part gets boring cause there's a lot of legal wrangling and this went back and forth. However, eventually the IRS comes down on Scott, and they come down hard. It's estimated that Scott underreported his income to the IRS by about $4.5 million. Now, my friend never told me how much the IRS was able to recoup, but Scott's businesses are no longer his businesses, and $4.5 million would put the whistleblower reward at $675,000 to $1.3 million. Keep in mind it's based on what the IRS collects, not the amount that's reported. I've asked my friend how much he got in the end, and he's simply said I no longer have a mortgage, and it would have been much cheaper for Scott to just pay me. Now, here is the end of our today's story. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Guys, let me know if you had any encounters with such people in your life and what's your opinion about them in the comments section. So before leaving, please hit the like button and do subscribe to the channel to stay tuned with us for more awesome stories.